Welcome to Innovating Music, a podcast from the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and the UCLA Center for Music Innovation. I'm your host, Dr. Gigi Johnson. Excited today to have with us as guest Seth Schachner from Americas. He really shared a great history of how he's been able to be that deal guy, putting together disparate deals in a changing music industry, to now helping different areas that are unknown, underknown, international, cross-border, and pulling together those pieces with some of the same skills that he has built, being part of a lot of early digital music. So he shares how he works on partnerships and strategy in Latin America and other spaces and places, looking at different types of social music, virtual reality, and how he's been able to build from time at AOL, Zamba Records, Sony, lots of other places, a leading edge practitioner consultancy that is getting to a chance to work on the edges of all sorts of cool things in music. This is the first of what's going to be probably 2 interviews with Seth. The second one, which we'll follow up with in a few weeks, is also taking a look at a lot of the current details of all of the interesting moving parts and pieces of deals in the digital music space. One of the themes this is, I think, year 3 now of this podcast of Innovating Music, is that we really hear more and more a story of kind of bridging old and new, and taking old skills, old relationships, a lot of depth or different dimensions, and people who have been finding their own way or new tools to connect a lot of the existing industry, people, structures, et cetera, to new tech and new ways of doing things. And I know that you were wonderful in coming to share that with my music industry fundamentals class at UCLA this past term, which was a great way to kind of wrap a lot of that stuff up. But I really love that lens and the way that you kind of live that story. So can I beg your tolerance to maybe take our audience through how you got to the current spot? And then we can come back to the cool type stuff that you are connecting the dots and the pieces on that are between all the types of old industry and new industry stuff. How in the world did you get to this spot?
Sure. And I love coming to your class. It's a great environment. So I think there's a couple levels to the answer. So, there are some overriding industry factors, macro factors, if you will, that certainly weren't unique to me, but that I think affected a lot of us that worked in the recorded music industry, whether you're in labels or other parts, but particularly for the labels over the last, decade, basically. And then there were certainly some individual factors. I mean, just totally on a macro factor, obviously the recorded music industry, I think, roughly halved itself in terms of the size, say, between the late 90s and the early part of, say, around 2010, you had a period where, even going further back into the 90s, you had 6 major recorded music labels. I worked for several of them, that there's now 3 left. And so I think, anyone who was in those structures during that time and spent, more than a short amount of time, experienced reorgs, all sorts of merger and acquisition activity. And so, I think there's more than a few people that were either in senior to mid-level executive roles that in some way got unloaded, put into the market in different ways. And I'm certainly, I think I lived through 4 different mergers or demergers in an 11-year run at something that became Sony Music. And certainly that informed some of the activity, and what happened to me. But I think on an individual level, for me, I'm someone who's worked in major media and tech companies for most of my career. I think if you charted up all the interests, I was like, I think they work for everyone except for Disney, something like that, or every interest except one that's been controlled by Disney. Not that I don't like Disney, I love Disney, but so I worked my way up, actually starting here in Los Angeles, in kind of a baby business analyst job at 20th Century Fox, through a lot of different steps that got me to where I am, and I think I experienced all these mergers and all sorts of changes, throughout my career. I had a wonderful run that ended at Sony in 2010. Spent a few years at Microsoft, which was a really interesting place, but a for me, it was a big, complex organization. And
Well, before you get past that, so
yeah, sure.
you came from being in film and music, so you're kind of living those spaces, and then you ended up working with Microsoft in media.
Yeah. I'm someone who pretty much has always worked, in, I guess, that area where content meets distribution, whether that's through technology or audience building partnerships and business development roles. And I started at 20th Century Fox. I mean, was one of my first steps in the entertainment field, 1992, and just doing basic modeling.
When we were small children.
Yeah, and I'm Fox Plaza, and at the time Fox had a deal with BMG, which was one of the 6 major labels at the time, Bertelsmann owned, and I started modeling film soundtracks as part of my duties. I mean, my main duties there were to model film deals before we would greenlight them and learn the front end, the back end, the projections. And I'm kind of a marketing oriented business development person, so it was definitely not the easiest thing in the world for me, but I learned it, and kind of used to go to my boss and say, "Hey, I really love music. It's why I got into this business. Can I go down to the music area and learn some stuff and help?" And he said, "Sure." So I started modeling movie deals, soundtrack deals. I think Fox had a soundtrack releasing deal at the time with BMG, and started learning just the basics of how music deals work: back ends, producers, points, recoupment scenarios. And so I worked my way up from there, got hired at a company called, at the time it was called MCA Music. It was the smallest of the big 6 record labels, in a business development role at a holding company there that held, I think it was 6 different companies at the time, record labels, event production groups, live entertainment. And, I'm academically an MBA, and I know you guys got a great business school program. And so I think we talked about this a little bit with your students, but you kind of come in through the front gate, if you will, and you have certain elements on your resume, and you're lucky to get hired for something that you like. And I think the ticket in for me was sort of these financial and modeling type jobs, if you will.
Well, this was me when I came in as well. I mean, I originally, one of my 9 career areas was doing modeling at Paramount. So totally have lived that dream and walked in that door.
Yeah, and I think for some people, I don't know. I mean, I had a lot of angst at the time doing it. It wasn't something that, I mean, I was in a major Hollywood film studio or in a major record company, and the gig was just to sit on it was a Lotus spreadsheet at the time, and to do, spreadsheet modeling. So it wasn't necessarily my dream, but it was something I kind of got reasonably decent at. I think I still remember, I mentioned this to your class, the first day I started at MCA was the day that Kurt Cobain took his own life. Actually, I remember that, but I also remember one of my bosses, Zach Horowitz, who's still a mentor to me, who I really have tremendous respect for, coming in. And I think the first assignment was, we're negotiating with the estate of Jimi Hendrix. Go out and figure out mechanical royalties, see if he can tweak it, do a modeling scenario. I think that was assignment number 1 for me walking in. So, it was that sort of work that I guess I cut my teeth on and got into the business on. But I transitioned to music, and about 2 years into the MCA experience, they were merging, I believe. Was it with Seagram's at the time? And I had done a strategic plan for our chairman, a guy named Al Teller, who I think, also a lot of respect for.
I was on the banking side of that deal. So,
okay. So we're probably different rooms.
It all comes around. But part of it, I mean, so coming in and knowing how to understand the nuts and bolts, also understand the economics when the industry changes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think, look, sometimes you can see these macro things when you're in the trenches. Sometimes you can't. I mean, one of the things that probably one of the coolest projects that, I got at the time, which frankly, I can't tell you I really knew, but we started to look at this thing called the internet. We didn't really know what the opportunities were. This is 1994. And so I was part of a team that led this project looking at, what is the internet for Al and what could be the opportunities for us. And around that time, a very good buddy of mine who I'd gone to graduate business school with, who's a UCLA grad, but we went to Columbia Business School together in New York City. A guy named Roger Neal, who is still a dear friend, had left his role at Time Warner to go to this startup in Northern Virginia. And I still remember having dinner with him one night here in LA at an Indian restaurant with him and his wife and my wife. And he was like, I'm going to this thing called an online service. It's in Virginia. And I was like, what the hell is that? And, 3 months later, he called me and said, it's this thing. We're called America Online. We're growing and we need someone to run a music channel for us. Would you come do it? And so I happily moved from my modeling roles to something that was much more, being dropped into the front lines of an emerging business in Virginia. And it really changed things for me immensely. It was an unbelievable transition for me to be dropped into something that was like a startup summer camp when I was there in Virginia at the time. I still remember, walking in to meet someone who was on my team, and literally they had like 8 contracts that had been printed out with blank spaces in them. And one of the staff was just writing in, Polygram, 8% deal, not exclusive, like literally without any kind of thought on the relationships that were being made at the time. And so I kind of got dropped in by fire in the earliest days of digital music to AOL's music team. And it really changed my life professionally. And it was a fun, somewhat discordant, wild experience. But I still look back on it really fondly just because of like the way it transformed things for me and added completely different dimension to, what would have been prior just sitting in offices modeling stuff.
So I'm going to take a pause and ask us to think about, if I was someone under 30 thinking of AOL, I think of this ad-based thing that's been bought by Oath and isn't the big dial mover that it was at the time, where it was the closed splinter net closed system where you go in and you'd get your entertainment, you'd get everything. It's not just what your grandmother still uses with an AOL email address, but it was actually for a while on the cutting edge of things.
Yeah, at the time, in the United States and to some degree globally, AOL was like the central player getting everyone onto the internet, basically the commercial internet. And let me just even pause that back and just simply say that AOL was probably the principal online player for most Americans and many international audiences, in the market in general. This was before web access and web browsers and had even kind of come into popular acceptance. In fact, when I was at AOL, we had, the explosion of things like Netscape, and what we thought was a dire threat from, Microsoft, who were bringing out a competing closed internet ecosystem called competing MSN, which is a competing ecosystem. But AOL was a closed kind of content universe. It was built around something called Rain Man, which was AOL's proprietary, software at the time. And we set up a little online universe across lots of different verticals: sports, entertainment, weather, travel, finance, absolutely. Licensed in content from big media companies, but also had an arm of the company called the Greenhouse that set up our own proprietary ventures as well, which we invested in. And probably most critically, that overlied all this were these communication tools that, maybe younger people would laugh at it now, but chat rooms, message boards, something called AOL Instant Messenger.
It trained us. In many ways, the reason I wanted to break it out a bit is that, or take that pause, because in many ways we thought we were getting past that we were getting into the open internet. We were getting into that AOL with having that closed, safe, proprietary bucket that were kind of the training wheels for people to get online. We don't need that. But instead I didn't coin the term splinternets. It's been around for quite a while, but we're almost back to that with people coming into closed-ish environments, trying to have everything in one place so you don't need to go anywhere else.
Yeah, I see a lot of that in music still, or attempts at that. But this is the very, very different worlds. I don't know if you're comparing space programs versus Gemini or Mercury before Apollo, or whatever it was. But these were, and I said this in your class, actually, these were, initial revs at entertainment media companies, other types of verticals, online strategies. In fact, while I was there, this is 95, 97 to 97, loads and loads of companies would look at us and go, well, we want our own website. Are you going to give access via your web browser to our website? And why would we publish on your platform if we can publish on our own website? And it actually, by the way, I think audiences now think about AOL maybe as some afterthought that became part of an overall advertising vehicle. We were mostly subscription driven at the time. We charged our members by the hour, and we shared that revenue with our content partners. And so, if you spent more time in VH1 online, right, or Fox online or BMG online, we'd be able to charge more, share more revenue. That model changed. Bob Pittman, who now is a Clear Channel chairman, came in and I think reinvigorated or just changed AOL's business model, made it an all-you-can-eat model. And I think was it 10 or 12? It was $20 a month, and that led to this enormous surge in usage. This was around 96. I think the company was sued by a lot of states, actually, because we had all sorts of usage issues. And it was a genuinely chaotic experience to sit through, basically, particularly if you're managing, large partners at the time. But one of the things I recall, and I think it's got to still be valid, is that we had partner content areas that, if they appeal to certain audiences, niche audiences, if you will, they would be the best. They would outperform all the others. I'll give you two examples, which is that when I got there, we had these basically fan club communities, which were mostly just message boards that you post messages on. Nothing terribly sophisticated at all. From Jimmy Buffett's fans, they call themselves the Parrot Heads, and from the community of Grateful Dead fans. And, these were things that were managed by fans, people who were doing it as a labor of love. These things were tremendously more popular than MTV, VH1, pick the media properties, Spin, Rolling Stone, all of whom we had patiently licensed and created all these, sophisticated revenue sharing scenarios with lawyers. So, and I think that's still kind of valid today, if you will, if you look out at, what appeals where, and you really have to hit those fans and engage them online. So it was a different kind of complexion, a different group of things that I was managing there compared to where I'd come from, which were major Hollywood studios and major labels in LA, where there were rules and, this was a little bit more of a lawless environment. A lot of fun though.
So I don't want to spend too much time in older term history. So you're doing such interesting things now, but how did you end up from that to Microsoft, and what are the other kind of pivot points or pain points on the journey?
Well, my group at AOL got blown up, during this sort of business, transition they made in 96, 97. And so I moved back to New York. I worked at Viacom in a business development role for a while. And I joined, after about a year, a smaller arm of Liberty Media that had music assets. I've always been attracted, once I got kind of the AOL bug, to smaller growing parts of the company rather than sitting in corporate, basically. And so through my own research, I saw there was a growing kind of music holding company in downtown Manhattan that held a bunch of different music assets. SonicNet, which was one of New York's kind of seminal music websites. It bought a West Coast service called Addicted to Noise. Bunch of other assets like The Box, which was an early cable network, and joined them for a year. And they went and merged with Viacom a year later. So
there's a bit of a round trip that happens.
Yeah, but I didn't want to go back. So at the time, I had met, just during my AOL period, someone who's still a mentor and a model to me, a guy I still look up to, and a close friend, a guy named Kevin Conroy, who has had some similar career parallels to me. And I believe I gave BMG their first sort of online deal while I was at AOL. Kevin had the foresight to introduce me to, at the time, it was a big independent music group with a funny name. It's called Zamba Recording Corporation. and it was about $1 billion in revenue, so it wasn't that small, or a little bit under, I believe. But it held Jive Records and Verity Records, Silvertone, bunch of professional music industry businesses as well, management companies, and went and met their COO at the time. It was a really different cultural sort of, they were kind of much harder core, harsh music guys. I was like, these are really tough dudes. I'm not sure I could get along with them. In fact, I don't know if I stormed out of the lunch, but I left leaving the first lunch going, this is not a guy, get along, whatever. And turns out a year later, I joined them after this Liberty Media experience and did digital business development and strategy for them, leading their digital team starting in 99. This is a company that kind of supernovaed while I was there. We had these teen pop artists, Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys, and Justin Timberlake was in a group called NSYNC that came to us from RCA at the time, and a lot of other artists as well. And just the company, was really the largest and most successful of all the indies. And I had a role there with, a digital team where we were experimenting with basically this country's first real generation of digital music services. The 3-year period, the 4-year period before iTunes had launched, there were dozens of digital music startups in the US and Europe and Asia that were trying to build a legitimate digital music ecosystem. So we were licensing to all of them, selling to all of them, but also investing in some of them. And these things ranged from, what I guess I'd call foundational digital technologies like DRM providers to early versions of streaming services. I don't know, companies like Liquid Audio, Click Radio, Reciprocal Music, AT&T had something called A2B, an Atlanta-based company called Amplified, Supertracks in Oregon, trying to test all these out with our content and with early stage sales and distribution programs.
So as a deal dude, you've seen probably more diverse deals across business models than most people.
Yeah, I mean, from the digital music perspective, I've certainly seen loads of different flavors of it, loads. And, I still remember, just to zip back to even 1 second to the early days of AOL. I mean, I think we did the first digital download for the company with a John Mellencamp song in 96. And, it took 45 minutes to get one song, but we had 80,000 come for free, people download it. We thought that was amazing. But some of these other things, which are probably equally absurd, but, trying to sell downloads for $2 to $4, a la carte around 99, 2000, 2001, era, where, the download's incompatible with certain types of devices. So, a lot of the early attempts, trial balloons to build the digital music business were, I don't want to say laughable, but that's all they were. And we were trying to find models that worked. Most of the companies we tested out are gone. I mean, I think Rhapsody is still around, or Napster, whatever the name is now, but all the rest are, they're gone. But the company was sold through a put option forcibly to BMG Music. It's one of the most spectacular transactions of all time. I don't know if it was meant by design or by happenstance, but our owner, Clive Calder, put the company forcibly to BMG Music in 2003. And
so a put, and I've got 10 years in banking, so I've kind of lived too much, but a put being that it's an option in a contract to have the right to sell under certain conditions to the other person.
Absolutely. And I think, I wasn't intimately privy to the details of the put or the call option. There was a call option, I believe. At the time, this entity that I was working for, Zamba, which most people know as Jive Records, had distribution deals. And, this is also very different from the current state where, to get into the markets at the time in a big way, you needed a major to distribute you, I think. And so we had these distribution partnerships in the US and then internationally with BMG for the US, and I believe internationally with a company called EMI, which was Britain's crown jewel that's now part of Universal. And I believe in the BMG deal, they had these kind of put and call contracts, and BMG had a minority pieces of this company, Jive. And Mr. Calder was able to go to BMG and say, look, I don't know what the multiple was, but assuming it was, say, an 8 times cash flow, and Gigi, you could probably explain this better than I can. Here's the value of the company now, given that we've got NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, and Britney Spears sales. And so the company was put forcibly to BMG for, I believe it was around 2.5 billion,
Just small change. Just small change.
Probably a little bit more than what it was actually worth, but nonetheless, that's what it was. And there was quite a fight for 8 months. And I had an incredibly quixotic 8-month period where I was kind of told, sit in your office, don't do anything, don't do any earth-shaking deals, we'll figure something out. And I was able to make a transition to BMG. They kept me, and some of the people at Jive left, some of the senior people. And I kind of started, this is around 2003, 2004. And at the time, groups of people had, I think, sat with Apple. I'll mention a guy named Paul Vidic, who ran Warner, EVP of Strategy and Business Development, and others. And they figured out, presumably, a way to launch a store that was, easier to use, more acceptable to the public than some of the things we've been trying. And so the iTunes store launched in 2003 while I was at BMG. And, I think it was a huge transformational, part of, of the industry's development, at least digitally speaking at the time, and that alongside with, mobile carriers and, mobile phones getting smarter and more sophisticated, particularly in international markets like Europe and Latin America, Brazil, started to get people coming to me from the organization asking these basic questions like, what is this thing called a polyphonic ringtone or a master ringtone? What the hell should we be doing with it? How should it price? What should our, and these are things that we genuinely do not have answers for. So I kind of attached myself to that off the menu. It wasn't something that I was supposed to be doing.
And yet that got to be, I was, looking at all the projections at the time, or people, that was the saving grace. These way too highly priced ringtones that you had to sideload because people didn't know how to cut and edit their own stuff, or couldn't, other than a couple hacky software things that you could actually get off the shelf at Circuit City. That was going to be the saving grace for a while, or ringbacks, or all that fun stuff.
Yeah, ringback tones, absolutely. And I think, look, I'm a big believer in the mobile market, Jen. I still am. So, I'm you're not going to get me to, knock ringtones ever. Actually, I think that there's something about personalization, and I'm not speaking to what Spotify does with playlists, but I think, I think there's uses for these things, and there's certainly, and I mentioned this to your class too, if you think about how they were priced, well, some people can say it's absolutely ridiculous to pay $2.50 or $4 for a ringtone. But, there are things that you pay a convenience for, or a premium for convenience. And so that informs some of these mobile products. And I know when I got to Sony, so this company BMG merged with Sony around that time, 2003, 2004. Again, kind of just to state the basics for people that are asking why all this merger activity. The underlying revenue base of the recorded music industry was being
slaughtered,
was being attacked. Yeah, we haven't even talked about piracy, but at some point it'd be worthwhile to talk about that.
Well, we've got what I want to do is bring us to the current era, and part of it is that you bring that great lens of having worked through all of these changes to get to where we are now. Finally, not on a downward but an upward trajectory for recorded music, but now 75% is streaming in the US. But trying to figure out how do you put deals together with disparate areas, which I find fascinating, in this new era. So how do you take those superpowers of all that stuff that you saw and worked on, and how are you doing that? How in the world did you get engaged with Latin America? What's happening there? And how do you think about new types of contracts with some of these new relationships?
Sure. So those are, there's, let me take the Latin stuff first, because I'll just try not to address it for too long, because the first piece of your question is really interesting. But, I survived the Sony BMG merger by looking for parts of the world where there was developing digital opportunity and where we were quite simply very under resourced. And, there's an enormous Latin American market, big piece of it in the US, 60 million people sitting right in front of most of our noses that people don't always recognize as a market, but it is. And a big region where I started to get these absurd questions that I just mentioned to you, like, well, what's a ringtone?
Yep.
And so I put my neck out the line and went to our presidents, guy named Thomas Gawicki, who I still look up to a lot, who's at Warner Brothers now, and Thomas Hesse, who I have enormous respect for, who was our president, and said, I'm sitting in this corporate gig here at BMG, and you're having me write spreadsheets. Why don't you let me go out and do deals and bring in revenue and really build a market for you? And you're not touching the Latin market. So here's a plan for me to do that. And I think they thought I was a little nuts, because I'm not,
It's good to be a little nuts. It's always good to be a little nuts.
Well, they were like, how are you connected to Latin America? I speak Spanish fluently, but I did, and so, but they let me kind of test out the markets from New York during this very complex merger between the two companies. And I started traveling all over the region, Brazil, Mexico, and doing very similar stuff to what I did at Jive, hooking up revenue-oriented deals for downloads and ringtones with carriers and download services early stage, and making bits of money for the Latin region, which is a separate arm of most organizations, either sitting in Miami or other places. And everyone seemed to love it. So they moved me down to Miami in 2005, and I had a great 6-year run running and building their Latin teams throughout the region, basically. And that's how I kind of got the Latin world, the Latin music business experience.
And so what does that mean now?
Well, what I've tried to do since this period, I run a consulting. I call it Strat Americas, and the idea is to target growth-oriented areas of the entertainment business. We've got a pretty strong whatever focus or depth in music, helping out with partnerships and strategy. And what we tend to do is look for high growth areas, and we can go through them all, but social music, VR, blockchain, enterprise software, where we can add value. Because I have a lot of Latin relationships now, whether we're talking in the US or out in Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, we do tend to get a lot of client interest around the country and really around the world, for Latin-oriented territorial opportunities. They may be content owners in Latin America, or they may be American companies that want to go into some of these regions. So it's I think, given me a special kind of skill set that enables me to go out and help clients in the Latin genre.
And then you're working then across a whole bunch of interesting entertainment tech verticals that are kind of, I tend to think as music plus or music and connecting music to other interesting things happening.
Yeah, and this has been kind of the best part of it, is that, I think I don't know if you would, a couple kind of, maybe qualifiers, and then I guess some of the bigger organizations, if you looked at, I don't know, Spotify or Apple Music or Deezer, even Amazon, some of these big companies that are very heavily resourced, they don't necessarily need the help of third parties or consultants. Sometimes they may not, but there are lots of things happening outside of streaming. And I've written some blog posts about this in digital music that I think are very opportunistic, probably under-resourced, where people with business development headsets can really help out. And so I've kind of consciously tried to seek out a lot of those areas. Social music is probably the areas where, or what I'd call social music, where I've kind of had the deepest engagement. I work with a big social app community called Smule, SMULE. I guess it Sonic Mule is what it stands for. I know it's a curious name.
But you know what? I've never known what that stood for all this time that company's been developing. So when you say social music, it is music, tools, and applications by which we collaborate around music or comment or share, because one could think that musically now as of end of 2018, owned by ByteDance and part of TikTok, that's social music in its own weird, wacky way.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, yes to all of that. I mean, I think there's probably different verticals if you did a formal definition of social music. I mean, certainly collaborative music. And I'd add things like Splice, which is, a community that folks can share beats and producers can. And, I don't know if it's still in existence, but Broadjam, Indaba, these are all communities that involve sharing or creation in some ways. And certainly collaborative ones with instruments, Magic Instruments. Smool itself, I believe, started as a collaborative music community. I mean, they have an app called Magic Piano.
Magic Piano, yeah, and the Octarina. I used to play the Octarina where you blow into your iPad.
Yeah, and auto rap? You can turn your voice into a rapper, and and I think those things. I mean, Smool's marquee application is Sing, and where you sing with the star, and that's most of what I've been doing for them is bringing in artists and major Latin artists into their app. But I mean, I think even just the raw collaborative ones like a Magic Piano, probably more people use it, than just doing the full on singing with the star. If you're sitting, on a subway or in a bus, you're probably not going to be singing, blurting out a song in front of 50 other people.
I don't know. Somebody was definitely doing that in the seat behind me on the LA Metro yesterday.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Not necessarily with that app, but they were singing along to.
But what I mean, really, but for me, I mean, to your real question, I mean, to me, and, musically and TikTok are probably, I think that app has been subsumed into TikTok and ByteDance. I think it's more part of a broader, I don't know, news and content strategy as it is purely music. And I believe musically was actually lip syncing, where an app like Sing is, we bring in stars and the stars have to sing and you got to sing with the star. And it's definitely much more of a collaborative approach than just lip syncing. So to me, I'm probably partial, but Smool is a truer, representation of what we're talking about in terms of social music. But what I really mean by social music is even zipping up higher, is the aggregation of communities and artists connecting with the communities. It's all about that connection. And I think that's, probably the thing that informs why it's so successful and so intriguing to me. It isn't necessarily a core function of a digital music, digital music or recorded music per se, as much as it is about the fans connecting with their audiences, with their artists, their favorite artists. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so cool about it to me. And I think, if you look at like Smool, what I've seen in terms of the usage in Latin America, I've probably been responsible for, I don't know, directly or indirectly, probably 75, 80, I don't know, different types of artists coming in to perform, from the biggest, Ozuna or J Balvin, to lots, Sebastian Yatra, Carlos Vives, but lots of other independent ones or smaller ones that are developing. And what is so cool about it is the artists tend to see the interaction between their fans and themselves in kind of an organic way. It looks live. We just tape the artist once, and that tends to override a lot of these other things that we've been talking about, including business models. By the way, it's not without going into detail. It's some of these things are very basic streaming models. They're not things where, big giant advanced checks are being written. It's more about kind of promoting to your audience and connecting with the audience. Mm-hmm. So, but I think it's a cool area. It's definitely one of these areas where I don't see some of these streaming services dominating it. So,
then you had mentioned AR, VR, mixed reality stuff. What are you experiencing in that potentially overhyped and still moving its way world?
Well, it definitely, I just got back from CES last week in Las Vegas, and I was, pleasantly blown away, pleasantly surprised to shocked to see the area that I've been working on in VR, which is the underlying audio, spatial audio or 3D audio. And probably some people hear that and roll their eyes, but that, it's one of the more fundamental parts of the content environments is to spatialize the audio along with the video. And, there's loads of very interesting audio technologies that are in the market. And I've worked for several of them. One is called Mach 1 that's done quite a bit of work with film studios that has a little bit of an enhanced product tweak in that it can pan the audio in addition to spatializing it. And some of the major studios like Fox have worked with that. And another
pan meaning that you can take the existing audio and have it have sides to it that is then part of the engagement with the perceived space.
Yeah. I mean, and that there. I mean, there's probably dozens of these audio technologies in the market, but my kind of area that I've landed in that touches VR because of the music background has been through the spatial audio world. And I'm actually an investor and a shareholder and have been an active consultant advisor to a company called Bach Audio that is created by just a brilliant guy named Edgar Schwery on the East Coast. He's a Princeton physics professor. That company in Florida has picked up kind of the IP license on. And that was kind of my earlier steps, looking at the VR world, trying to get that partnered, whether it's with hardware platforms or, spatial audio can land in an automobile. So you can if you're driving a Ford, the kids can listen to something different than the parents up front, and you can also put it on a speaker, and even a cheap speaker, you can hear the audio being spread out. So I was also really blown away. Sony now has something that they just, I think it's 360 audio, 360 real. I can't remember the name of it, but Sony actually has its own spatial audio that it just brought out specifically just for music, not even talking about VR. And, Magic Leap is coming out with, more and more product enhancements and content associations. I saw, for example, Sennheiser has a new product called Ambio that, literally spatializes audio to music and images. So just a lot of cool activity around 3D audio has been sort of probably the area where I spent most of my time. I mean, I see plenty of platforms that are trying to be maybe the next YouTube for VR or maybe the next event-based music platform for VR. Endless Wave, The Wave, Next VR. There's one here. Some folks from Australia have just landed. They're trying to do a live kind of event-oriented VR strategy. There's quite a few actually around the country. I don't necessarily see any that have some business model that are going to be wildly successful at this point. They're not revenue generators for the industry. So I can't tell you that the hype is untrue,
Mm-hmm.
probably is true right now. But definitely spend a little more time on the audio stuff. And the other area that's a little more closely linked to that is, kind of AI and bots. I mean, there's definitely these interesting bot communities out there. The bot platform in the UK. There's one here in LA called Stashimi. Octane is another that are all trying to automate some of that dialogue between communities. They might be on Messenger or artists or in some cases brands. And I've had a little bit of experience in that area as well. I think that's kind of a quieter but kind of exciting area that's developing too.
You have covered the waterfront. You have done all sorts of interesting things working with the historically changing music innovation space. You're working with a diverse group of folks looking at what I do tend to call Music Plus, where music's changes and other industries' changes are kind of overlapping, where you can find opportunity and bringing different regions together. You've shared a little bit on where we are going on a few things. Putting on your wizard's hat and crystal ball, what excites you looking forward?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, to me, I think the social music is very, very exciting area to me. But what excites me, I think, the most is kind of the increasing globalization of music and digital music growth, basically. So a lot of these areas that I'm touching on are super exciting to me. But I mean, one of the things I've seen in the U.S. is kind of this sort of cross-cultural mix of content, if you will. So, for example, I did a little work with the artist named Luis Fonsi, who had a track last year called Despacito.
Just a tiny track.
And we didn't know when we worked on that it was going to be such an explosion, but clearly was, and it clearly was it engaged lots of different audiences, and to me, that kind of mix, if you will, informs a lot of things, because I think all these businesses we're talking, we haven't even talked about live music or blockchain, some of the ticketing and event stuff. All these areas have potential disruptive aspects to it where there are actual businesses out there. But I mean, I think to me, this kind of blending is very exciting, if you, whether it's content or whether it's just business interests that want to partner in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America. I see some of my industry colleagues from the Latin region doing things in Africa now, or taking on global roles where some of the stuff they've learned in emerging markets can be applied across a lot of different technologies and verticals. And I think that kind of continuing globalization is super exciting to me, because I think there's loads of digital opportunity that will develop in some of these new markets that we're talking about.
Well, we are pretty much near the end of our conversation. We could, I think, probably talk for another couple of hours on stuff. What would be something you want to make sure you mention before we wind up today?
Well, I think, I said this to your class, but I think it's looking to some of these underlying areas of the digital business that aren't resourced and are still developing, that may not be the flashiest things that are in the headlines, where I think the growth is going to come from, basically. And that's what I've tried to do, as a digital business developer, and what I'm continuing to do. So that's probably what I'd leave in everyone's mind.
So if people want to follow up with you or bug you about any of these things you've talked about, how could they best find you?
They can definitely go to my site, which is stratamericas.com, or you can email me at seth@stratamericas.com, and we'd be happy to talk to you. And I really appreciate the chance to speak, Gigi. It was great, and hoping to keep it up with you, and as well as your classes at UCLA.
Any place to find you on the socials?
You can find me at my LinkedIn is Seth Schachner. Just look me up, and also on Twitter, it's at Stratamericas or at Seth A. Schachner as well.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, and best of luck on all of your continuing adventures.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, that wraps up this podcast. Many thanks to the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and the UCLA Center for Music Innovation for being our hosts of this ongoing series. You can subscribe to us in all the usual places, or you can come find us at innovation.schoolofmusic.ucla.edu. Join us again to follow the other adventures that we will be tracking down in innovating music. Thanks again.